Hello, and welcome to Just Therapist Things, where we talk all things therapy. My name is Jordan, and I am an associate marriage and family therapist from Southern California. I currently work in a private practice where we focus on child anxiety reduction, and I also do some work for a nonprofit cancer support organization. Also, a disclaimer going into this episode. In this episode, my guest and I are discussing men's mental health using the binary that society has created. We do not agree with these binaries, but these are the binaries that play out in society, even if they do not reflect reality. It is also necessary to note that the mental health discussion and experience varies based on your gender and sexual identities. So again, we are talking in the binary in order to address issues that have arisen because of it. And also a trigger warning that we do discuss topics such as suicide in this episode. Welcome, Cam. I'm so glad to have you as a guest today to talk about men's mental health. So first off, can you tell the listeners a bit about yourself?
Yeah, hi, Jordan. Thanks so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to this. I guess just like a little bit about myself. I grew up and live in Southern California, but I've spent a few years in England, a few years in France. I'm crazy about soccer and traveling and weirdly into psychology as well. So just a good balance of sports and psychology, I guess.
Yeah, that is awesome. Very multifaceted person. So you are in a therapy graduate program. So can you tell me a little bit about what type of program it is and if you've started your practicum experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a master's in marriage and family therapy at Antioch University here in Culver City. It's basically just a certification to practice on the relational level with people who are experiencing mental health or familial issues. It's not necessarily just for people who are experiencing just problems in their marriage or just problems in their family, but it takes a more relational approach to understanding the problems of the individual. Mm-hmm. In terms of practicum, I actually just got my placement a few days ago, which I'm really excited about. It's a no-cost online clinic for families who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford therapy. And I'm starting that in October, and I'm really excited for that.
That's awesome. Congrats. And that is so needed, so hugely important. And what you said about the misconception of the field of marriage and family therapy because of the name, I completely get that. And, I hope that this podcast helps people understand what it really is.
Yeah, I remember, when I was asking you, because you went into the program earlier than me, I remember asking you a few times what you were doing. You were like, all right, it's in marriage and family therapy. And I was like, oh, cool. Like you're going to be a marriage counselor. And you're just like, no. Yeah. Everybody asked me that.
Yeah, exactly. I know. It's really neat. I mean, we can really just do anything, and it's really cool to see kind of the different specialties that people go into from our programs.
No, absolutely. It's so malleable depending on the purpose. And I really like the relational approach because, I think if we look at people just in terms of individuals, I think you're missing a huge part of the picture, which is the effect that our relationships have on us.
For sure. Absolutely. And that is something that we will get into more in this podcast. So that is great. So how did you realize or kind of figure out that you wanted to be a therapist?
Yeah, it's funny. Early on, even when I was in middle school, I'd go to Barnes and Noble and I'd pick out a couple little sci-fi fantasy books, and then I'd also find myself in the psychology section, and I just pick something out. I wouldn't even always finish it, but I'd just be like, oh, this is about the mind-body connection. What is that? Wouldn't understand half of it, but I was always interested in psychology and just how that could help us just live more connected and meaningful lives. I felt like that was the route. Mm-hmm. I ended up kind of straying from that for a little bit when in college, thought I wanted to do econ, tried out a bunch of things. I was like, that's not really for me. Ended up back in psychology, and now I'm really happy to be doing that again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is amazing. So you made the switch after college, it sounds like after you graduated. Did you realize that you wanted to get into psych?
Yeah, I briefly tried a career in communications, and just it didn't feel fulfilling like at all. I was working on like a very kind of macro level of like international development and all this, and it was just so bird's eye view that I felt like even if we were instigating change, there was no way to tell. But working on like the individual or like familial level just really, I don't know, really appealed to me because I like being able to look at another person and have a conversation and figure out what's going on and see like the individual, like, I guess, progress over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you always been, would you say, pretty in tune with your emotions and in tune with the relationships that you have?
Hell no. No, that took me a very long time, and I'm still in the process of kind of coming into that. But that was something that I recognized was a weakness of mine very early on, which is why I think unconsciously and consciously I gravitated towards psychology. Yeah, I just don't think I was. We'll get maybe a little more into this later, but like as a guy, I have so many memories of just being taught to like suck it up, or whether it was like a physical or like an emotional problem, and I just wasn't really taught to like identify and communicate emotions effectively. So that's been a route that I've been trying to just get better on like throughout the years. Yeah. And trust me, I was terrible at it. So if anybody listening, you have a ways to go too. Like, you can get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first step is awareness, and it seems like you came into that awareness and then you were like, oh shit, like I need to get better at this, let me start working on myself. So I feel like you just kind of need that wake up call, that initial awareness in order to develop yourself. So that's cool that you're in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of coming into that awareness is just like asking yourself what you really want, like out of like your relationships and the extent to which you're actually able to achieve that. Because like without an understanding of your internal world, you can't have emotional intelligence, and you'll end up accidentally putting all your shit on other people.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a way to say that, but
So how has it been for you being a man in a field that is typically woman dominated?
It's been, feels normal at this point, because I studied psych in college, and I was very used to being. Well, it's funny. I was half psychology, half philosophy, and so I'd go to all my philosophy classes. It would be all dudes, and then I'd go to my psychology classes, and I'd be the only guy in like a sea of 30 women in the classroom. So it feels pretty normal to me at this point, especially because I've just found over time that as I've kind of gone to more therapy, done more work, and therefore need to have friends who are comfortable, talking about like emotions and being vulnerable like that. Most of my close friends tend to be like women, because women tend to be, socialized to act that way a little bit more than men. I will say though that it's not, I do think the assumption is that it's like therapists are disproportionately women. And I do think that is true, like to an extent. But when I look around my classroom, there's still there's a good amount of us there, and I think the proportions are going to be changing in the coming years.
Yeah, that is really great. And why do you think that it's changing?
I think partially because I think men are starting to wake up more to how unfulfilling it is to live an unexamined life, where you're not aware of what's going on internally and like your own triggers. And I just think, I don't know, I think we're starting to figure it out as a society more. I think we have a ways to go. But I think men are realizing that we got to put the work in, and that also it helps to have a man in the therapist chair sometimes, just because therapy is necessarily relational, like it's a relational thing, and everybody brings a different perspective to the chair, you know? So, the more, I can't believe I'm going to say this about like putting men in like, you know, in positions to describe like a diversity of experience, but
yeah,
you know, the more, you know, the more perspectives we can get on the other side of the room and like in the therapy chair, like the better, and the more people we can help.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned that, you know, women are naturally kind of more socialized to be empathetic and nurturing. And that goes back to the hunter-gatherer days, you know, where men were the ones that were out getting the meat, and then the women were the ones with the kids. I feel like, so how do you think that translates to now? Like, is there still a stigma that men cannot be emotional? It's obviously changing. But what do you think of that progression?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that it's, I go so back and forth on like the nature versus like nurture debate, because I think there's no way to test it. So it's really difficult to take a like scientific stance on that. I do think that women are socialized like in the present to be more collectivistic and more like interpersonal, for better or for worse. Like the fact that women tend to be socialized to be more interpersonal means that like in larger groups, the onus to take responsibility over like interpersonal problems generally falls on women rather than men. And that's like an unfair amount of the emotional burden, right? But in terms of, I guess, why men grow to be like more out of touch with their emotions and not understand what to do about them, I think in our society we've created a very weird power structure where like we put men at the top for one reason or another, and we've decided that in order to look powerful, you need to be individualistic and stoic, and you need to project strength. And anything goes against that, like, tends to threaten whatever power structure we put in place. And that's why I think it's good that this is becoming undone, because I think patriarchy does damage to everyone, you know, because it's stratified us in a way that's unhealthy. But it also does damage to the people like at the top, like that we place at the top of the pyramid of the hierarchy, which. And we said that, oh, you have to look powerful because like this is your place, you know. But with that comes just like such a denial of a very human experience of what it means to connect with others and be emotional and to be vulnerable. All these things that we need to live fulfilling lives.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Tangent there, but.
No, it's very important. And I feel like with that, you know, with men kind of being the projected, have to be strong, have to be powerful, emotions have historically been seen as weakness, right? Because it's associated with women. And women were lesser, and women are the emotional ones, and all of that. I feel like now, hopefully, I mean, from what I've seen, that men are realizing, oh, it's actually a huge strength to show emotion, because it's an extremely vulnerable place to be in. And also, as you said, it facilitates relationships and it facilitates connections. And so really, you know, emotions are an incredible strength to portray and to, you know, connect with others.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what I've that's what I've liked observing, I guess, over the last maybe 10 years or so, is like a decoupling of like the concepts of vulnerability and weakness. And then instead flipping that and saying, well, like, because you can only be brave when you're afraid of something and choose to do it anyway, that actually makes vulnerability a sign of strength rather than anything else. So I've liked watching that flip happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, since you have been in the psych therapy field, how have you noticed, or if you have noticed, that your relationships have shifted, or specifically your relationships with men?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely noticed with the friends I already had before I started the program, they're more likely to come to me like when they want to talk about things, and more likely to hear me out when I need to like open up as well. I think just because they kind of seem to see me as I guess like a safe place in the storm because I'm studying it, and they know I'm not going to judge them or anything. Whereas I think they might expect that judgment from other men sometimes. Mm-hmm. And then just in terms of like, I guess how I select friendships and how I choose to let people in, it's definitely like my criteria has like changed almost entirely. Like I'm willing to put up with less because I think for like a long time I was very not like comfortable, but I was resigned to the fact that in order to be a part of like certain male friend groups, I would need to become comfortable with just talking about sports, probably just drinking a lot, and then really not talking about much beyond like the sports and like the surface level stuff. And now like whenever I'm introduced to like a new person, I kind of know what to test like a little bit. Like I'm looking to see if they're comfortable like talking about, you know, certain topics that I think are important, like things like mental health, or, you know, just to what extent are they vulnerable, like in general. And I think it's been really important to, I guess, just like redefine who I let in and who I give that kind of energy to. Yeah.
That completely makes sense. And I feel like I do the same thing now. I feel like my boundaries in relationships have shifted so much. Like I know the people that I want in my life and the people that I don't want in my life, and I set those boundaries, which has been really interesting. And the criteria that you said too, I feel like I'm kind of the same way, because I want to have those deeper relationships and I want people to be able to talk about things. So I do the same, you know, with mental health. And also I primarily work with cancer and people affected by cancer. And, you know, that's like a huge word too, same as like suicide. So I love seeing, sometimes I test the waters and I kind of see how people react when I say that I work with cancer, and see kind of what their responses are like, which is funny, but it is. I mean, it shows a lot about a person when you say those trigger words. How do they respond?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you can also see the difference between when someone really wants to evade the topic versus when they might want to like stick in there and talk about it, but don't quite have the tools to do so. And at that point, like I just look at that as they're intending to, you know, to like be vulnerable and like try and do this, but they just might not know how to yet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then if you form a relationship with them, then you can model that with them, which is cool as well. Or, you know, if they have questions, they can ask you. So a statistic from the World Health Organization says that 1 in 8 men in the US experience a mental health disorder versus 1 in 5 women. However, men's suicide rates are 4 times that of women's. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so I think there's nuance in this, even though I think it's useful to think in terms of like these statistics. I would probably just question the statistic of 1 in 8 men. I feel like there's a high probability that that's underreported, given the fact that men are less likely to seek help and also less likely to realize that there's a problem going on with them until it reaches that crisis point. And then I would also just point out that the fact that there's the discrepancy in suicide rates to an extent has to do with the differences in the methods that are chosen, like between the genders. Men tend to choose means of suicide that are much more lethal than that of women. Women tend to choose, I think it's drug overdose or otherwise. And men tend to go with, you know what, I don't feel like naming them. It feels gross.
I get
but
that.
men just generally tend to choose means that are just like the lethality of them is like just far outweighs the means chosen by women.
Yes.
And then just in terms of like how we're socialized, and then the values that we then tend to like espouse after like that socialization, is that like women tend to value interdependence, and they are more willing to consult friends and accept help when they're going through like tough times, whereas men feel the need to appear strong. We tend to value independence and decisiveness more, and so like as we're going through like those tough times, it's very much just like, nah, like I can handle this. And also, I think a piece of that as well is that I don't think men are great at creating the space, like within like their social circles, where being vulnerable like that, it really feels to the person like it will be received in a way that it is helpful. Because I think if you're reaching a crisis point and the groundwork isn't already laid within like your social circle for being vulnerable and like knowing how to ask for and like receive help, like what makes you think that someone who's going through the lowest like moment in their entire life is all of a sudden going to decide, okay, now is when I can start to trust these people? Like I don't think that computes.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that is huge. And I feel like that is exactly it. If the foundation is not there for having these tough conversations, then why would people at their lowest points in crisis situations, why would they reach out then? It just doesn't make sense. And I think that a lot of the talk nowadays about like, oh, if you're in crisis, say something, reach out to someone. But if the foundation is not there, that's not going to do anything. All of the speak up, talk about it, that doesn't mean anything if you don't have those connections. So we've talked about how the connection is not really there for men because of so many reasons, because of emotions as a weakness, as, the need to be strong, as how we're socialized, the bro culture, all of that stuff has kind of made it so that the foundation is unstable or it's not even there for men in their social circles. So for anyone who's listening, who is thinking, I want to develop that in my friendships, I want to develop that in my relationships, do you have any tips on how someone can do that?
Yeah. So in my life, I mean, I like to straight up ask when we're hanging out sometimes, like I'll be at the bar with my friends and, we'll sit down and I'll be like, hey, like what's going on? How you doing? And they'll be like, oh, I'm good. And, just be like, no, but like really though, take a sip of my beer, look at them.
Yeah.
Let them answer. If they resist and they're just like, oh, like I don't really like want to talk about it, like respecting their boundaries is actually like a huge part of making sure that someone does feel safe, like being vulnerable, like knowing that at any point they can choose to share or not is super important. So even just asking the question and respecting that they might not want to talk about it in that moment, I think goes like a really long way, because it communicates that you're available, but also that you respect them and you respect the extent to which they are ready to disclose or not. I also just try and remain curious, because I think asking questions and showing genuine interest is just one of the easiest and most effective ways that you can show that you care about someone. And you can really see, like the more I have these conversations with people who aren't like quite used to them, I can see like the more questions I ask, the more they're really dying to like talk about it, and like that they're excited to talk about it, like in some cases. And we'll talk about like all this stuff, just like what's going on with them, how they're dealing with like the breakup, how's dating life, what was it like growing up in like the house, in the house where like you grew up. And like at the end they're always just like, man, like I don't know why it's so hard to like talk about this stuff. Why is it so hard to find people to talk about this with? And like that's so across the board that if we all just did like in the first place, I think we'd realize many more people are open to having these conversations than we think. But yeah, if I were to distill it down, it's really just like asking the question, respecting any boundaries that are set, but making it clear that you're available and just being curious.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it really all starts with a question. It sounds simple, but I think it's hard, especially if someone is in a friend group or in an environment where that is not the norm, then it's hard to be the one to kind of break that norm. But it sounds like it's hugely important, and it actually opens the way for people to really, get into the depths of what life is throwing at them and kind of what they've been through. So that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can guarantee you in any, in any like guy friend group where, the whole thing is, fantasy football, going out to the bars and, playing pool and just, talking bullshit. Like, I can guarantee you almost everyone there, like, wants to be able to talk about these things. And in particular, you can find one guy to kind of like start that colony with, where it's just like, the other guys are playing pool. You're just like, hey, what's up? Like, you want to talk about some shit? And be like, oh yeah, I do. And then you just start that colony there, and then it slowly spreads.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is huge. That's great. Yeah. So for anyone listening, if you are thinking about kind of starting that in your own friend group or in your own relationships, it seems like the advice is to just do it, because it can't hurt. It might feel vulnerable. It might feel weird to do, but it's super important to just start the conversation and to just ask someone simply how they're doing. And if you sense some shit's going on that they're not saying, respect their boundaries, but also stay aware of it and know that you're creating that safe space for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like, hey, how you doing, man? No, really, you want to talk about it?
Yeah.
And I think you'll see some results.
Yeah. That is awesome. Do you have any closing thoughts or any takeaways for our listeners today?
Yeah, I guess I like to think about vulnerability in these terms. And that's that letting people in and letting them see what makes us feel weak is scary. That's why it's so hard to do and why we don't want to do it sometimes. But the only real way that we let ourselves and our friends down is if we act from a place of fear and choose to keep people out in favor of protecting ourselves, which is important sometimes, but you know when you can let those walls down. But the only way we can really learn how to be strong and to help ourselves and our friends grow and connect with others is by pushing past that fear we have of letting people in and appearing weak sometimes and just doing it anyway.
Yes. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here. It was so great to have you on the podcast. And I know that what we have discussed today will just really land for someone out there and will really be helpful. It's such a crucial conversation to have. So I really, really appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks. Thank you so much for listening to Just Therapist Things, and I will talk to you soon.